Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me. And most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. Please help us to spread the word by taking a minute to rate and review the show in iTunes and by telling your friends and colleagues. Bill Weihl has likely done more to drive down greenhouse gas emissions from the tech sector than any single person. He was the green energy czar at Google, building the strategy and the team that took the company to 100% renewable energy and to carbon neutrality for its primary operations. He also led the way for the rest of the industry by helping to form the Climate Savers Computing Initiative and RE100. Did I mention that Bill also directed Facebook's sustainability efforts? He has a fascinating story, which includes 19 years as a student and then professor of computer sciences at MIT, and also a stint as CTO at Akamai Technologies. In our conversation, Bill talks about his path and his view that corporations must now move from taking action for their own climate impacts to leading through policy advocacy. He believes that employees are key to making this happen. I think you'll enjoy our conversation. Bill Weihl, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with your childhood. I know you grew up in Cincinnati. Tell me a little bit about growing up and what your parents did.
Sure. My dad was a pediatrician, taught at the University of Cincinnati Med School, worked in the public health clinics there. My mom was a nurse, did not work for pay outside the house after they had kids. And also, I think another reason she didn't work outside the house, my dad got polio in 1949. And after a couple of years was able to kind of go back to work and live a sort of normal life. But a lot of our family life revolved around helping him. He was in a wheelchair the rest of his life and needed help getting in and out of the car and many other things. So that was, I think my mom's life was very devoted to helping him.
Sure. How many siblings did you have?
2 brothers, both older.
And do they also have sort of STEM backgrounds?
Yeah, my oldest brother was a doctor. He's now retired, and my middle brother was a mechanical engineer and then went into management.
So, did your interest in math and engineering and ultimately computer science sort of stem from your parents' focus on science or not necessarily?
I'm not sure. I was good at it. I enjoyed it. And I was good at history and English and so on, but it didn't grab me in the same way. And I'm not sure if that was it, why that was, just sort of the way it worked out.
And did you have a sense of environment? I know that your professional focus on environment came obviously much later, but what was your experience of just nature and the outdoors when you were a kid?
We spent a lot of time outside. We lived in sort of the suburban area of Cincinnati, semi-suburban, but certainly not in the center city. Our house was surrounded on 3 sides by, woods, forest. And there are a lot of kids, and we were on a dead-end street when we were at the end of the dead-end street. We and neighborhood kids spent a lot of time outside running around in the woods and, fields nearby playing baseball or football or whatever. So there was a lot of time outside. And, my mom, we recycled back when that was really hard.
Yeah.
We had boxes in the basement that we filled with bottles and cans and newspaper and whatever, and the bottles had to be separated by color because there was the green glass and the brown glass and the clear glass, and there was a miscellaneous, or I don't remember, and then we would take, when those boxes were filling up, we'd pile them in the station wagon and take them up to the recycling center and get to dump these big boxes of glass in the bin, the dumpster, and have
Hear
it all
them
go
crashing,
shattering.
yeah.
And it was great fun. But a lot of people didn't do that. Of course, there's also, I'm talking about 60s, early 70s. That was back when a lot of things were, came in bottles that were returnable and where you were expected to return them, whether it was milk or Coke bottles or whatever. And that started to shift, and much more, things where there were deposits, but a lot of people didn't take them back, and then people started discarding or maybe recycling. But we were recycling all that kind of stuff early on. And, there was a compost pile, not a bin, but a pile that my mom, sort of the edge of the woods, where my mom would keep kitchen scraps, and we'd go dump them out there every day or two. So I just had this sense of don't waste, recycle, that kind of thing from early on. Yeah. The other thing is Cincinnati. So Procter & Gamble is headquartered there. And air quality generally in the 60s and 70s in a lot of places in the country was not great. We're talking about Ohio River Valley, a lot of coal plants in the Ohio River Valley. We were sort of farther east. I think the air was much worse, but Cincinnati is still not great. And we would often in the summer have these 90-degree humid days with air inversions where all of the crap coming out of the P&G smokestacks, because they were doing a lot of manufacturing there then. It wasn't just, sort of headquarters. Now I think they outsource a lot of the manufacturing somewhere. But enormous amount of air pollution from, Tide and Ivory soap and whatever else they were making there, right? So we experienced really bad air quality regularly. And that affected me.
Was the community active in combating some of that air pollution?
I don't think people felt there was anything they could do. It was just sort of, it was in the air. So what's happened, right? We couldn't go picket P&G and tell them to shut down. So I don't think there was any sense of empowerment. In early 70s, Clean Air Act, EPA, and things started to shift. And I think that's what actually, in the end, drove change at a lot of factories like that, at power plants, was regulation that forced them to clean things up. But in the 60s, the air was an open sewer.
So as we mentioned before, you studied math, and you went to...
And computer science.
And both. Computer science. And you went as an undergrad to MIT and stayed at MIT for quite a while. Tell me how that experience shaped you. Did you start in just math and then?
No, I actually started in, elected a major in computer science and then decided to double major in math. Why? I don't know. Because I could, I guess. I'm not quite sure. I think these days I'm not sure I would recommend most people double major, but I liked math, and it seemed like I was interested in taking a bunch of math courses, and I could get a degree in the process. It wasn't hard to get the second degree, so I did. I think I was I wasn't thinking about my career as a way to change the world or improve the world particularly. I was thinking about, my personal life. I wanted to, avoid polluting and help clean things up and whatever. And I was looking for a field and career that was interesting and engaging and fun and that I was good at. And there wasn't a real connection to environmental stuff. Looking back, I'm not sure why not. No one suggested, I would say I didn't get a lot of career advice from anybody, honestly, in terms of people trying to understand what really motivated me in a way. I think people saw that I was good at math and science and especially computer science and encouraged me to follow that path, but didn't really try to elicit what was it that really sort of fed my soul. And I didn't know how to ask those questions then.
Yeah, and I think that in a lot of ways, that might be a luxury of our time now, where people see, meaning is almost an imperative, like you have to have a career with meaning. And also it's sort of an age thing. I didn't come to recognize. I think my career was always driven by passion, but it wasn't driven by meaning until
Yep.
sort of mid-career.
Yeah.
So how do you pivot then? So this is, as I see your career, you have the pivot after academia. You have this period working at DEC and then at Akamai, which are two different things, but both clearly in the tech realm. But then you pivot 180 degrees to focus on climate energy.
Or maybe it was a triple Lutz or Axel or I don't know. Something. Yeah.
Something.
I was a gymnast in high school and college, so
you know.
Though I was not actually. I didn't do. It wasn't that great at tumbling or trampoline. So, but I sort of get what it takes to do that. Well, I mean, the DEC was not a huge switch because it was a very academic-like research lab, but run by a company. And Akamai was a bigger ship because it was a business selling a service, but a business. So it wasn't about dream up whatever cool ideas and things you want to work on and go work on them. This was about we have a business, and you might have crazy ideas that someday could be relevant, but you might not be able to work on them for maybe ever, but for a long time. Though one of the things I've observed and many people have said is that constraints drive innovation. So sometimes actually there's this sort of the tyranny of choice. If you have just a wide open field, you can do anything you want. It can be hard to figure out what to do. And when you have a problem to solve, it's like, all right, well, let's buckle down and solve that. I've been interested in the environment and cared about it my whole life. I've followed renewable energy. We're talking about my early sort of childhood and so on, and the fact that we recycled and composted, and we were a suburban family in Cincinnati. It's like that. I don't think that was the norm. But my parents were children of the Depression, and so I think to my mom and my dad, it was you didn't waste. That was you just didn't do that. But I also saw the environmental effects of air pollution and in the 60s, just the amount of garbage that was littered everywhere was staggering. And so I just had this sense in my head of we needed to make the world a better place, that it was unpleasant and unhealthy for it to be like that. But I'd never brought that into my professional life. And so in late 2004, as I was thinking about leaving Akamai, having been CTO for a couple of years and spent a lot of time on the road because I was the only exec not in Cambridge. So I spent a fair amount of time in Cambridge and a fair amount of time on the road visiting customers and partners. And we had youngish kids. Seemed like a good time to stop traveling so much. And I think what the company needed from a CTO at that point was not so much the technical leadership and strategy and more the really high-end technical salesperson who could help grow revenue and make the case and bridge the sort of technology and business issues for a customer and help them understand why what we had to offer was really good for them. And I was good at that, but it wasn't what I wanted to spend my life doing intellectually, and also it would mean spending 90% of my time on the road. So as I thought about leaving, I'd been hearing about climate change, global warming, whatever we were calling it back then, probably starting in the mid-90s. Was sort of worried about it. 2000, Bush and Gore both promised to regulate CO2 during the 2000 election campaign. We know how that all worked out. For whatever reason, Bush didn't follow through. I think there were a lot of reasons. So 2002, 2003, I was reading more and more about it. It seemed to, it wasn't a crisis at the scale it is today, but I can do math and I could, read Scientific American and Science and other, magazines and things that made pretty clear that this was something that if we didn't change the course we were on, was going to be a serious problem. And as I said, our kids were, born in 94 and 98. So 2004, they turned 6 and 10. And both because I was thinking about, what world are my kids going to live in, but also, I mean, I hate it when people just say, well, I care because I have kids. It's like, or I care about women's rights because I have daughters or a wife. It's like, well, you should care because you're human.
Yeah, right.
Right. So I care for all of those reasons. And I do care about my kids, but I also care about the millions of people in Bangladesh that are going to be displaced or drown or whatever, or suffer in many ways. And so, I was finding that, in 2004, as I was thinking about moving on to something different, that when I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't go back to sleep and my mind was stewing about something, it was often climate change and what were we going to do about it and how could we do something about it and what could I do? Not whatever technical or business or other problem was going on at work. I mean, that was interesting and engaging and so on, but it wasn't what was, what my mind tended to focus on when I just had nothing else to think about. So I decided to see if I could do something professionally about it. And my wife actually had just gone back to school, changed. She used to do public policy work around low-income women's and kids issues. And in 2001, she went back to school and got a nursing degree, RN, and then a master's in nursing, became a nurse practitioner. So I'd seen someone completely change careers, and that was inspiring. Well, this is what I'm really interested in, and I'm at a point in my career where maybe I can follow, where I see meaning as opposed to just what is fun and interesting and I'm good at. So I spent about a year doing some consulting to help pay the mortgage, but then talking to people and reading and going to a few conferences to try to figure out what I could do without going back to school, because I didn't really want to do that. Having done one PhD and my wife having just gone back to school, it seemed like that was not the best plan at the time. Without going back to school, what could I do, given I had a kind of broad technical background and skills and deep computer science and sort of, what today we call tech background and some business experience. And I think, I'm good at understanding things from a systems point of view and bridging both kind of the high level, big picture and the details without getting mired in extraneous details. So what could I do? And where could I work that I could do something interesting and actually get paid to do it? And after about a year and talking to lots of people, it turned out there were some people at Google just starting to think about what was Google going to do about climate. Larry and Sergey were really passionate about climate when Google went public in, I think it was summer of 2004. And they set up google.org, which was their philanthropic arm. One of the things they wanted to focus on was climate change and contributing in some way to helping address that. So 2005, some people were just starting to think about how is Google going to do this? And so some friends of mine there.
Was Larry Brilliant running?
Larry got hired early 2006. I think it was either just before or just after I joined. So yeah, Larry was the first executive director or whatever of google.org. So friends there introduced me to the people who were really starting to think about, and they were thinking about how are we going to do this, but they weren't the ones who were going to do it. They needed to hire people. And I mean, you'd have to ask them, why did they hire me who was not an expert on climate change, was not an expert on energy markets, but I knew their technology and infrastructure really well. I knew their business pretty well.
I just want to pause because this is an important point, I think, when people are looking at career transitions, right? I was speaking with a friend yesterday, earlier in her career right now, but, has a certain amount of functional expertise and experience around sort of sales and marketing right now, wants to focus more on clean tech, is currently in the commercial real estate space and feels that, is concerned that she can't sort of do what she wants to do from an impact perspective in commercial real estate. But there are these lateral moves that you can make that build on where you're utilizing and leveraging your functional background and kind of wedding that to your passion in an area that you may not yet be expert in.
Right. And I think, I mean, I would say I was lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. Google was looking for someone to work on this and help them figure it out. And they didn't have the time. They needed to hire someone. And I spoke their language. And I'd also shown that I could learn new things and sort of move into areas that I hadn't previously. I mean, you can't get a PhD without doing something you didn't know anything about to start with. And I'd done that several times in my career, just in terms of new research areas and so on. So they believed that I could come in and learn what I needed to do, consult with experts where it wasn't something that I could go deep in or hire the right people or whatever, but that what they needed was someone who could figure it out and figure out what needed to be done. I think it is possible for people to make those kinds of shifts. It was a little bit like jumping off a cliff and grabbing the feathers out of the air and building the wings on the way down or something. I mean, to butcher a metaphor, there was no guarantee it was going to work. And I think part of, my wife had made this massive transition through a much more traditional, like go back to school and get trained, that kind of path. But I also, I had to remind myself that if it didn't work for some reason, well, I still had skills and could find a job, right? And that would be okay. And I cared enough about trying to make this work that I was willing to try. But it was a risk. It was a big risk. But it fed my soul in a way that what I'd been doing before didn't. And, it had meaning in a way that what I'd been doing before no longer did. But I think those kinds of transitions are hard. They're possible. But, I spent, as I said, a year talking to people and exploring without going back to school and getting trained in material science or this or that. Where are there things that I could do? And was lucky to, that Google was looking for someone to figure this out for them at about the same time.
So describe in the subsequent years at Google, which ultimately, we can say now, has a net zero operation. Can we say that?
Google is buying clean energy that in an amount that is equivalent to the amount of energy they consume globally. So they're using 100% clean energy. And if you want, we can go into what exactly does that mean, hour by hour. There are lots of people who will debate that. But I think doing it in a way that has really strong integrity in terms of they're not just buying renewable energy credits and saying, look at us, we're clean.
They're investing in on-site.
They're investing in on-site in some cases, but the key is a word that comes from the carbon offset world, what's called additionality, not in any dictionary, hard to spell, but you can kind of sound it out. But it's basically, if you are signing a contract to buy clean energy, is that contract actually resulting in more clean energy on the grid, additional to what was there, or not? Would it have happened anyway if you hadn't signed that contract? And if you buy just renewable energy credits, the additionality is typically pretty weak. They're also really cheap. To some extent, that ought to be a signal. You get what you pay for. So the impact you have is not that great in terms of more renewables on the grid when you just go buy renewable energy credits, especially today. Google has, and Facebook, no surprise, since I kind of drove the strategy in both cases, really focused, and I would say that, the folks who hired me at Google and pushed us, they didn't want to do something that was just check the box and be able to make a marketing claim. They wanted to have real impact. And I think I did, but they really pushed us to do that. So they are 100% clean energy and they are carbon neutral, so net zero carbon, which means for the part of their footprint, not from electricity consumption. So the electricity is handled by the clean energy they're buying. But then they have natural gas burned in the cafes and the hot water boilers and other things on site. And they have shuttle buses that move people around and other parts of their footprint that they can't zero out by buying clean energy. So for that, they do a lot to try to minimize that. And then for what's left, they buy carbon offsets. And again, in those cases, they're not just saying, oh, here's an offset broker, we'll buy some cheap carbon offsets and check the box. There's a real focus on additionality. Let's make sure we're buying offsets where we can pretty credibly say that there are real emissions reductions from the fact that we bought those offsets, right? So so they're at 100% clean energy, net zero carbon.
So how unique is this? And we can look and we can talk about some of the efforts industry wide that you helped put together, like RE100 and the Climate Savers Computing Initiative,
Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, yep, all that stuff.
And so, we do see a fair amount of voluntary action, not only in tech but in other sectors in corporate America. But we also see that it's certainly not always the case. I mean, Amazon right now is getting a lot of flack for using AWS, availing AWS and really partnering with the oil and gas industry to.
So are Google and Microsoft for their cloud services and
a little bit more under the radar. And Amazon is getting maybe more flack for it because they've been kind of a lot slower on cleaning up their own operations in the way that's
right. And I think their employees have started making noise about it recently, which has caused it to be back in the press.
Right.
But yes,
the 5,000 employee
over 7,500 have signed. So Amazon employees organized. They realized, we have stock because tech companies, startups, and even now well past the startup stage, give employees stock. So we have stock. We have standing to file a shareholder resolution. Let's do that. So some of them did that. And I think their shareholder meeting is this week, maybe today. So it's being voted on.
What's being voted on?
A shareholder resolution that was filed by a group of employees.
What does that resolution say? Do you know?
So there are two key parts, and I can't recite the details, but one is Amazon needs to disclose its carbon footprint, which it has never done.
Which is incredible that they've never done it, because that's been almost standard procedure for a lot of corporate America.
It's surprising, right? So a few years ago, Amazon announced they were going to do 100% clean energy, clean electricity for their, I don't remember if it was just their data center operations for AWS or if it was all of their global operations, including warehouses and offices. I'm not sure. But it was not, we're going to be net zero carbon. It was, we're going to buy clean electricity for where we use electricity. Most of their footprint is almost certainly in shipping. And if you go another layer or two out in what the sort of corporate carbon footprint reporting world will call Scope 3, then there's all the manufacturing impact of everything they sell, whether it's the Amazon branded stuff, which one could argue really is their responsibility, or even everything else they sell. What you have to decide, what are they responsible for? But they announced a few years ago they're going to be 100% clean energy someday. They're not there.
But not specific about scope?
For electricity. For their operations, okay? What Scope 2 in the greenhouse gas reporting world. And then they've been slow to deliver on that. And so they've begun to come under more flack they've been lagging their peers, no question. And I would bet, we'll know when they actually release data, which they haven't done, I would bet that the shipping footprint from ocean freight and air freight and all of the last mile delivery trucks and whatever completely swamps the electricity consumption in their data center.
I mean, most of that is actually Scope 3, except for their owned fleet. But
correct.
But still, it's so.
But it's their responsibility. Their business doesn't operate without shipping. I would argue there. Okay. So anyway, so the shareholder resolution is disclose the carbon footprint.
Yeah.
And put forward, I think they said, a science-based plan to reduce it. So IPCC says we've got to decarbonize by 45% globally, 45% by 2030, 100% by 2050 to have a decent chance of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. This is daunting, but still doable. And Amazon has not in any way, they haven't disclosed their footprint that would allow anyone to then say, are they anywhere on track to do that? And I think the answer is they're not. Nor they made a plan. So the shareholder resolution was, let's see a plan. Those same employees then decided, well, you're limited in what you can put in a shareholder resolution. The SEC doesn't let you just demand anything. You can't interfere in the day-to-day operations of the company. And the SEC throws out a lot of shareholder resolutions. They never come to a vote. So they were very careful to craft it so it would actually pass muster with the SEC. And then the employees said, well, we can actually write a letter to the board and we can say whatever we want in a letter to the board. The SEC can't tell us not to send it. So they did. They wrote a letter, an open letter, with the goal of getting signatures from Amazon employees. They were hoping to get maybe 1,000. At least that's what I've heard. At last count, earlier this week, they had over 7,500, including some VPs and directors, senior people high up. It's not just first-line employees.
And is the spirit of the letter essentially the same as?
It's the same but broader. So
this feeds it. Now we're skipping around a little bit, and I want to come back to Google and Facebook before we wrap. But you are looking a lot at kind of the distinction between corporate climate action, a lot of which you helped innovate, and advocacy.
correct.
Right. And a lot of these same companies that have been great on action have really been on the sidelines when it comes to advocacy. And, we can kind of understand why. They have a lot of interests that they're trying to protect and that are important to them. And, it becomes a question of political, not just political will, but political capital and what you're going to...
and risk.
And risk and what you're going to spend it on. So you've been working on this concept of, just as we're seeing with Amazon, of leveraging employees in these.
Well, and I would say that basically, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, but as you said, we got a lot of companies that are acting so and voluntarily, maybe because they feel it's good for the reputation, maybe because they see their peers are doing it, and if they don't, they're going to suffer in the marketplace or in hiring or something. So there's a lot of action. Companies buying clean energy, companies that have fleets beginning to work to clean up their fleets and move to lower carbon emissions from their fleets of buses and trucks and cars and whatever. So companies are acting, but when it comes to public policy that would help society move reasonably quickly on that same kind of decarbonization path, most companies are silent most of the time. Some companies are speaking up. I'd say, Amazon, Google, Facebook, the companies that have really been in the lead in a lot of ways on acting. And it's not just tech companies. I mean, Walmart has been a pioneer in sustainability for years, and Kaiser Permanente and Target and Marriott and a whole bunch of others. Most of them speak out occasionally on policy, but not very often. And a lot of them, probably almost all of those, if not all, speak out at the level of the sort of UN, the Paris Climate Agreement, right? So after Trump announced that the US would exit Paris, I guess this was June of 2017, actually a lot of companies and CEOs publicly encouraged him not to do that before he announced his decision. He teased us with we're going to announce a decision soon for weeks. And so people started speaking out and saying, this is a bad idea. We should stay in. Then he announced we're leaving. And some NGOs very quickly got together and organized the sort of sign-on effort called We Are Still In, that now I think over 3,000 companies have joined, as well as a bunch of investment firms and universities and mayors and governors and others, right?
And I'll just also say that as part of the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC is tracking and it's open to subnational commitments, which includes businesses. And I haven't looked at it lately, but it includes thousands and thousands of specific actions that companies and cities and states are logging in the UN framework.
And so there's an enormous amount of action happening. There's an enormous amount of innovation happening. New solar technology and new battery technology and new grid management technology to integrate wind and solar and other things into the grid, which is amazing and huge progress and just a huge quantum leap in leadership over the last decade from what we'd seen 10 or 20 years ago. And yet emissions are still rising. And so I think there's a disconnect. There's sort of this view. I think politics is hard, policy is hard. A lot of people have this view that government is bad or can't really accomplish much, so we should focus on private enterprise and innovation. That is not solving the problem, and I believe that alone will not solve the problem, that we will not get the decarbonization we need at the speed and scale we need just through this kind of voluntary action. That we need policies like, and California, I think is, I mean, not that the exact policy should just be replicated everywhere, but it is a model for how to go about this. We have a suite of policies, including cap and trade from AB 32, which was, I think, passed 13 years ago.
2006 originally, yeah.
Yeah, so, and then sort of renewed, extended. But we also have a renewable portfolio standard, which now with SB 100 passed last August, I think is 60% renewables by 2030, and then 100% zero carbon by 2045.
And we see other states adopting
and other states now, there are a bunch
standards.
of 100% zero carbon in a bunch of other states now following suit, which is great. But you need a suite of policies. It's not just a carbon tax or a price on carbon or cap and trade. It's not just an RPS. I think depending on the sector, some policy levers will move it quickly, and some won't have much impact. If I think about transportation, $100 a ton on CO2 translates to about $1 a gallon on gasoline. That's kind of within the range of volatility of gasoline, the price of gasoline. And if the price of gasoline goes up by $1, people notice because they go to the pump, and every time they go to the pump, suddenly they're paying more. It's like, And so they'll drive a little bit less, some people will. And when they buy their next car, if it happens soon after that big price spike, they might buy a more efficient car.
It's incredible how short-sighted people are. You see,
but then they'll get used to it.
You do see these trends though, where it drops for by $1 for a year or two, and SUV sales start to spike again.
And you can maybe say the automobile manufacturers see that that's where the biggest profits are, and so they put their marketing into teaching people that that's what they should want. I think there's some truth to that. But even if it doesn't drop again, people get used to it. It's like, okay, this is just what it costs to fill up my car. And over time, they start driving more again, and when they buy their next car, they don't really think about fuel efficiency as much. So we're not going to transform the transportation sector and decarbonize it over the next 20 years just by putting a modest price on carbon. If we put a $500 or $1,000 a ton price on carbon, maybe that would be enough, maybe. But I think we probably need other policies in concert with a price on carbon. So having been involved in a bunch of work on innovation, been involved in a bunch of voluntary action by companies like Google and Facebook, and working with many other companies in partnership, and seeing how fast things move. And in Google, in fact, we did a study. We worked with McKinsey to do a kind of macroeconomic study of, under various assumptions, how fast might we decarbonize. And I mean, this is a model. I'm probably one of the first to say, economic models are models, not reality. But even under the most optimistic assumptions, about sort of technology improvements and rates of adoption, there was no way, and this was back in 2010/2011, when the decarbonization sort of, ski slope we had to go down was much gentler than it is now. There was no way we could decarbonize fast enough without significant improvements in policy that would drive faster change. So I believe we need let's call it market rules. Doesn't mean big government investment. There might be some government investment in some cases, but that we need market rules that guide the market in the right direction more quickly, and that give us reasonable confidence that we will decarbonize at the rate the science says we need to. Because otherwise, it's hope. It's like, let's invent stuff and let's hope that it gets adopted fast enough. And I think all the evidence of the last 20 years is that just doesn't happen fast enough.
So what role do you see companies playing in driving towards those policies? Beyond utilities, beyond the ones that are already in that
right.
fight,
So there are companies, let's say, on the other side of the issue, most of the oil and gas companies who see climate action as a mortal threat and have been working for decades now to prevent or delay or weaken climate action. And I think they will probably continue to do so until something convinces them they really have to shift. And then there are companies like utilities, some of which have gotten on board because to some extent, for some utilities, they don't really care if they're burning coal or oil or gas or harvesting sunlight or wind or whatever. Regulated utilities make money by investing capital and earning a return that the regulator says you get to earn whatever their regulated rate of return is, 8 or 10 or 12%. And so if they get to invest more, they make more money. So they're actually happy to invest in new infrastructure, wind, solar, et cetera, because they'll make money off it. So to them, if it's like society is deciding we need to make this transformation, like, great, we're positioned to make money, we'll do that. Oil and gas and coal companies, not so happy, because unless they become energy companies and diversify and pivot their business, then their business is going to wither over time. But then there are all these other companies that aren't in the energy business, they aren't in the transportation business, and where their direct emissions are not that huge. And that's most of the tech companies, that's hospitality, that's healthcare. I mean, some of them use enormous amounts of electricity, but then they can buy clean energy. And these days, that actually, in many cases, is just cheaper. So, of course, why not? But companies have enormous influence in pretty much, I'd say every political system, right? They have money, they create jobs. Political leaders like to do things that bring jobs and prosperity to their district, wherever it is they are, they're the governor or representative or senator or whatever. So if companies are providing economic development and jobs and so on, that's something that political leaders like. And if companies take it somewhere else, political leaders aren't so happy about that. So there are lots of ways in which companies can influence and use their influence on policymakers. But they're mostly not when it comes to climate.
Right. And so you see the way of getting them in that game is by leveraging the interest of employees.
I think employees care about this issue. I think younger employees or students, college, graduate students, whatever, who are the people they're going to want to hire next year, next few years, care a lot. We see people, young people rising up in the streets and calling out us older people about, stop telling me why I should be hopeful. Greta Thunberg, this 16-year-old Swedish girl, young woman, telling leaders at Davos and at the UN Climate Summit, I don't want your hope. I want you to do something and fix this.
Yeah.
And so I think we're seeing young people realizing, A, that the future looks kind of dire, and B, maybe they actually have some power. And I think one of the ways in which they have power is they can influence their employer. And their employer has a lot of power wherever it operates, wherever it creates jobs. So what I'm hoping we'll see over the next year or two is a wave of activism by employees and by college students, graduate students, to encourage companies to really step up and use their voice and influence. Because at the state and local level, I think that's very, things aren't as polarized and as paralyzed as they are in Washington, D.C. And in other countries, Europe and other places, things are not as broken as they are in Washington. Things are still not moving quickly enough, but more corporate support for faster action I think would matter a lot. That you mentioned other states, or California passed SB 100 last year, 100% clean energy by 2045. Other states, I think Nevada, New Mexico, a few others have passed similar bills, and there are a bunch more over the next year. That
Washington just came out. Illinois is considering one.
Right. So corporate support, some of those are going to be legislative battles. Some of them have happened, but some of them are going to be hard fights. And corporate support saying this matters to us, it matters to our employees, it matters to the people we want to hire. It's the right thing. I think will change how people vote.
We definitely saw, as you know, you're a member of E2, and I do a lot of work with E2, in the various fights around AB 32 and the initial Global Warming Solutions Act, as you mentioned, of 2006, and the subsequent battles to protect it and extend it, leveraging business leaders, not on behalf of companies, but just on their own merit, but who employ people, both within clean tech and renewable energy and just industry at large, has an enormous, leveraging those voices and actually bringing them into state houses has enormous impact.
Yeah, I agree.
And so one can imagine that bringing the companies to the table themselves, maybe in conjunction with some of these younger leaders in the companies, could be quite powerful.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And there are, some companies are, Salesforce, Adobe, Unilever, a few other companies have been among the most, there are a few that have been frequently vocal, particularly at the state and local level, also in some cases federally, though not much is happening federally. I think the climate community is playing defense at the federal level at the moment more than offense, but even then, corporate voices matter. But most companies speak out only occasionally. And if we got, twice as many companies showing up at a state house or signing a letter of support or making phone calls around a clean energy bill in a given state or around a cleaner transportation bill or whatever, if instead of 5 or 10 companies, we had 10 or 20 or 50 or 100, along with the kinds of leaders from E2 who are not going as representatives of their companies necessarily, but are saying, I'm a business person and maybe an engineer, and this is good for the economy, it's good for business, and I can give you lots of reasons why. I think that's, all of that together is real influence.
So as we sort of bring this to a wrap, I just want to talk about this issue of governance, because that's really what it's about. It's bringing employee voices to leverage, to influence the board in the case of Amazon. It's just coming back to your experiences at Google and Facebook. It seems that the founders of Google had the interest. They had it fit with the sort of the cultural DNA of the company. Was that also the case with Facebook, or was Facebook sort of playing catch up from a sort of a cultural or leadership intention perspective?
I don't know that I would use the word catch up. I think that this was an issue that Ware and Sergey were deeply passionate about. In a way, I did not see that same level of passion from the leaders at Facebook. They cared, they clearly cared, and that's why they hired me, and we ended up hiring a large team, and they've got a large energy team that's focused on buying clean energy. But there was, I would say at Google, there was more of an interest of using the company and the company's resources to solve these broad social problems. And at Facebook, it was more about let's do our part, which was about our operations, and less about let's invest in innovation like RE Less Than C, this project we started in 2007, where we invested in startup companies and made some research grants and did our own internal R&D with the goal of accelerating innovation in the clean energy sector to drive down the cost of clean energy rapidly. So it was just without subsidies or penalties on either side, it would be cheaper than coal. Coal at that point being the cheapest generation on the grid. And I haven't seen other companies of any sort doing that kind of thing. But what Google has not done in a really systematic, sort of full-throated way is use its influence on the policy front. They've been active sometimes. They, along with many companies, have been active at the UN climate summits. Google was quite active, along with a few other tech companies, not Facebook, in speaking out in support of the Clean Power Plan, filing an amicus brief when the attorneys general of a bunch of states filed a lawsuit against the Clean Power Plan. Google and a few other tech companies filed an amicus brief in support of the Clean Power Plan, now moot since current administration has basically
Killed it.
Yeah. Or something. But, SB 100, which passed here in California last August, but barely, Google, Facebook, Apple, silent. Maybe they lobbied privately, without being public about it, but there were 35 plus companies, I think, who publicly spoke out in support of it. Autodesk, Adobe, Salesforce included, Dignity Health included, but the other big tech companies were silent. Kaiser Permanente, I'm not sure if they were silent or not. I think I haven't seen their name on a list. And these are all companies that are committed to 100% clean energy for their own operations. But when California was debating and fighting and almost failing to pass a law that would commit the state to the same thing, they were silent. And their support would have made it, in the end it passed. And so, legislation is binary, it passes or it doesn't. So that's great. But I think there's a lesson in there that it would have passed much more easily with more corporate support. And we've seen examples, SB 350, you may remember several years ago here in California, it had three pieces: accelerating the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, I think doubling building energy efficiency, having building energy consumption in the state, and having transportation emissions. Transportation emissions piece got stripped out of the bill, and the remainder passed. I don't know of any major companies that lobbied in support of the bill. There probably were some, but in the tech sector, silent. And I think that's a mistake. I think that companies, if they care about climate, and honestly, if you're a company with any sense these days, I don't see how you don't care about climate. You have influence and power in our political system. This problem requires policy to drive the market in the right direction fast enough. It's a timing issue. It's not.
If you're an employee at one of the firms that you mentioned, or more broadly, who really cares about this issue, but it's not your day job to get involved in it, and you want to influence your company to become an advocate, how do you do it?
Well, that's what I and a bunch of other people are working to figure out, because there is no playbook. But I think part of it is you speak up. You speak up about why it matters to the company, because as much as I would love companies to do something because society needs it and it's the right thing, in the end, they're going to do it. What will really move them to do it more quickly is if they see a reason it matters to their business. So why does it matter to a company? Well, if they find it's hard to attract talent because they're on the wrong side of an issue that young people view as a human rights, civil rights, existential issue, which I think many young people do for climate, I think that will motivate them to behave differently. And I think, what we saw with LGBT rights a few years ago, the bathroom bill in North Carolina, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana, both of which were discriminatory legislation passed in those states, which companies then helped fix. Basically told the states, you need to fix this or we've got a real problem. And maybe that means we have to leave the state or we stop growing. In North Carolina, I think was it the NBA All-Star game, I think, moved out of the state. And I think some of the NCAA, playoffs also moved. And talk about hitting North Carolina where it hurts. I've heard they care about basketball there. But companies stepping up and telling those states that they thought this was a big mistake. And furthermore, that it was a problem for them because their workforce was really unhappy about it and was not okay working for a company that was complicit with this kind of discrimination. And not that I don't think many people would have quit. I think it would have made hiring harder. And I think that we're getting to the point where young people's view on climate is similar, that if you're on the wrong side of this issue, I don't want to work for you.
Yeah. So I can hear the excitement in your voice, and I'm feeling the excitement around this new initiative. So I look forward to tracking it and participating in any way that I can, and that the podcast can help promote it. Just before I let you go, are you optimistic that we can turn the corner on this emerging crisis, or not?
Part of me wants to say that's the wrong question.
How so?
Okay. Well, in the following sense, I think we have spent a lot of time over the last number of years worrying about how do we give people hope and make them feel optimistic. And I think actually reality is important. And the situation is dire. This, Greta Thunberg saying, I don't want your hope. Take it and stuff it. I mean, she didn't say this, but stuff it somewhere, right? I think, we each have our psychological makeup. My family would probably say that I'm not a glass half full person. I'm partly, I don't think it's because I was trained as an engineer, but I see the potential problems. It doesn't mean I get totally depressed by them and weighed down, but I see the way things could go wrong, and then I work to fix them. And so I don't think it's about, are you optimistic or pessimistic? To some extent, we're all going to feel the way we feel. Reality is what it is. I think it's important not to sugarcoat it and not to try to say, well, you should be optimistic because historically the human race has, humanity has innovated and sort of gotten our way out of incredibly complicated problems. Well, I think one could argue none as complicated and difficult as this. But we also are approaching tipping points where once we pass them, not clear we can go back. Arctic methane gets, we get enough warming that Arctic methane starts releasing, and that causes more warming, and we get more of it. At a certain point, it doesn't matter what we do. And we don't know where those tipping points are. So the risk we're taking by continuing to dither is enormous. So personally, I would say I am pessimistic but hopeful. So I have hope, but that doesn't mean I'm optimistic. I think that we have discovered this is an incredibly difficult problem, in part because there are really powerful, wealthy, vested interests who are doing everything in their power to slow our response to this problem, because they're preserving
to stay wealthy and powerful,
their wealth and power, right? So I prefer to, I think we all have our psychological response, and I think it's important to talk about that. But I think it's then important to figure out where are we going and to focus on that, not on what, different narratives are going to work for different people. I'm motivated by a sense of urgency and a really intense, I was motivated 15 years ago to change careers by a sense of urgency. For some strange reason, I feel a stronger sense of urgency today than I did then, maybe because I can read and do math. But that's what motivates me. And what keeps me from just being depressed and hopeless is acting and looking for what I can do to try to help move things. And I would encourage everybody to, if you're optimistic, great, but don't have that turn into a Pollyanna-ish wishful thinking of what I would call wishful thinking of, well, we'll just innovate and somehow it'll magically get fixed in time. Take a clear-eyed view of and look at what's happening and what's going on with emissions and what it will take to actually move things. I don't know if you know Hal Harvey. He's one of the most amazing, I hesitate to call him a policy wonk. He's not just that at all, but he's one of the smartest people in the climate world I know. He just put out a new book called Designing Climate Solutions. And it's about policy in large part, but it's basically about sector by sector, what policies will create what kind of impact. And part of it is we need to invest in innovation. Part of it is we need policies that by constraining the market will drive innovation. And part of it is we need policies that will drive deployment of the things we already have. So I think it's about, whatever motivates you to feel urgency, great. If you feel positive and optimistic, great, but retain the sense of urgency and then figure out how you can act that will really drive progress.
Well, Bill Weihl, thank you for your time today, and thanks so much for the work that you're doing. I'm excited to see what's next.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanky. Theme music also by Ian Swanky. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please tell your friends and give us a rating and review on iTunes. See you next episode.